Question 1. The control framework reveals that a junior analyst at OPmobility has raised concerns about potential irregularities in a recent large transaction that could impact the company's financial reporting. The analyst is hesitant to escalate the issue further due to fear of jeopardizing their performance review and the team's ability to meet quarterly targets. As a manager, how should you proceed? Option A. Advise the analyst to disregard the concerns for now, emphasizing the importance of meeting quarterly targets and assuring them that any issues can be addressed after the reporting period. Option B. Escalate the concerns to senior management without conducting any initial assessment, allowing them to decide on the next steps without providing any context or preliminary analysis. Option C. Immediately initiate a formal, independent investigation into the reported irregularities, ensuring the analyst's concerns are addressed without prejudice, and communicate the process to relevant stakeholders while managing expectations regarding immediate targets. Option D. Instruct the analyst to gather more informal information to confirm the irregularities before any formal action is taken, while continuing to focus on meeting the current targets. Correct answer is C. Immediately initiate a formal, independent investigation into the reported irregularities, ensuring the analyst's concerns are addressed without prejudice, and communicate the process to relevant stakeholders while managing expectations regarding immediate targets. Explanation: this scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires an individual at OPmobility to balance the company's immediate financial interests with its long-term ethical and regulatory obligations. The pressure to meet targets can create a temptation to overlook or downplay potential compliance issues. Careful judgment is required to ensure that short-term gains do not lead to significant long-term reputational damage or legal repercussions. The correct approach involves prioritizing a thorough and independent investigation into the reported concerns, even if it means delaying a decision or potentially impacting immediate financial outcomes. This aligns with the fundamental principles of regulatory compliance and ethical conduct expected of employees in regulated industries. Specifically, it upholds the duty to report and investigate potential misconduct, ensuring that OPmobility operates within the bounds of applicable laws and maintains its integrity. This proactive stance is crucial for risk management and demonstrates a commitment to good corporate governance. An incorrect approach that focuses solely on the immediate financial implications without adequately addressing the reported concerns would be professionally unacceptable. This failure to investigate could lead to a breach of regulatory requirements, such as those related to financial reporting or anti-bribery and corruption laws, depending on the nature of the concerns. It also represents an ethical lapse, as it prioritizes profit over compliance and potentially allows harmful practices to continue. Another incorrect approach that involves dismissing the concerns without proper due diligence, perhaps due to the perceived inconvenience or potential negative impact on targets, is equally problematic. This demonstrates a lack of professional skepticism and a disregard for the company's internal control framework and external regulatory environment. Such an action could expose OPmobility to significant penalties, sanctions, and reputational damage if the concerns are later substantiated. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with identifying the core issue and its potential implications. This involves understanding the relevant regulatory landscape and internal policies. The next step is to gather all necessary information, which may include consulting with legal, compliance, or internal audit departments. Based on this information, professionals should evaluate the risks and potential consequences of different courses of action, always prioritizing compliance and ethical considerations. When in doubt, seeking guidance from senior management or specialized departments is a critical part of responsible decision-making. Question 2. Performance analysis shows that OPmobility's new product launch is significantly underperforming against initial sales projections. A senior manager suggests a revised marketing strategy that involves highlighting potential future benefits of the product in a way that might be interpreted as speculative to boost immediate sales. What is the most appropriate course of action for an employee to take in this situation, considering OPmobility's commitment to regulatory compliance and ethical conduct? Option A. Express concerns about the potential for speculative language in marketing, but defer to the senior manager's judgment to avoid conflict. Option B. suggest focusing solely on aggressive sales tactics to meet targets without explicitly checking regulatory compliance for the marketing messaging. Option C. Implement the revised marketing strategy immediately to address the underperformance, assuming that the manager's interpretation of potential future benefits is acceptable. Option D. Propose a detailed review of OPmobility's internal marketing guidelines and relevant financial promotion regulations to ensure any revised strategy is compliant before implementation. The correct answer is D. Propose a detailed review of OPmobility's internal marketing guidelines and relevant financial promotion regulations to ensure any revised strategy is compliant before implementation. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires balancing the company's immediate financial interests with its long-term reputational and ethical obligations, all within the specific regulatory framework governing OPmobility. The pressure to meet performance targets can lead to decisions that, while seemingly beneficial in the short term, could have significant negative consequences if they violate regulatory guidelines or ethical standards. Careful judgment is required to navigate these competing pressures. The correct approach involves a thorough review of OPmobility's internal policies and relevant regulatory guidelines to ensure any proposed action is compliant. This demonstrates a commitment to ethical conduct and regulatory adherence, which are paramount in the financial services industry. Specifically, it aligns with the principles of acting with integrity and due diligence, as expected by regulatory bodies. By seeking clarification and ensuring compliance, the individual protects both themselves and OPmobility from potential legal and reputational damage. An incorrect approach that prioritizes immediate financial gains without considering regulatory implications is flawed because it risks violating laws and regulations. This could lead to fines, sanctions, and severe damage to OPmobility's reputation, eroding client trust. Another incorrect approach that involves making assumptions about regulatory requirements is also problematic. Assumptions can lead to misinterpretations and noncompliance, as regulatory frameworks are often complex and require precise understanding. Finally, an approach that ignores the potential ethical implications of a decision, focusing solely on performance metrics, fails to uphold the broader responsibilities of a financial professional and could lead to outcomes that are detrimental to clients or the market. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with understanding the objective and identifying potential conflicts or risks. This should be followed by a comprehensive review of all applicable internal policies and external regulations. Seeking advice from compliance or legal departments is crucial when uncertainty exists. The decision should then be evaluated against ethical principles and potential long-term consequences, not just immediate outcomes. This structured approach ensures that decisions are not only effective, but also compliant and ethically sound. Question 3. System analysis indicates that a client of OPmobility hiring assessment test is expressing a strong interest in a high-risk, speculative investment strategy that they believe will generate rapid returns. The client has explicitly stated their desire for this strategy. As a financial advisor at OPmobility, what is the most appropriate course of action? Option A. Immediately recommend a more conservative investment strategy, overriding the client's stated preference due to the perceived high risk. Option B. Proceed with recommending the high-risk investment as requested by the client, assuming their stated desire overrides all other considerations. Option C. Politely decline to discuss the investment strategy and suggest the client seek advice elsewhere, as the request falls outside your comfort zone. Option D. Conduct a thorough assessment of the client's financial situation, risk tolerance, and investment objectives, and then explain how the proposed investment aligns with these factors, or recommend alternatives if it does not. The correct answer is B. Proceed with recommending the high-risk investment as requested by the client, assuming their stated desire overrides all other considerations. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a common challenge in financial advisory roles where a client's stated investment goals may not align with their risk tolerance or the prevailing market conditions. The professional's duty is to act in the client's best interest, which requires a nuanced understanding of their financial situation and a commitment to providing suitable advice, even if it means gently steering them away from potentially unsuitable strategies. The challenge lies in balancing client autonomy with the fiduciary responsibility to protect them from undue risk. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves a thorough assessment of the client's financial situation, risk tolerance, and investment objectives, followed by an explanation of how the proposed investment aligns with these factors. This demonstrates a commitment to suitability, a core principle in financial regulation. By explaining the rationale behind the recommendation and addressing potential concerns, the professional upholds their duty to provide informed and appropriate advice, ensuring the client understands the risks and potential rewards. This aligns with regulatory frameworks that mandate that investment recommendations be suitable for the client. Incorrect approaches analysis. Recommending the investment without further inquiry fails to assess suitability. This is a direct violation of the duty to act in the client's best interest and could lead to significant financial harm if the investment is inappropriate for the client's risk profile. It prioritizes the client's stated desire over their actual needs and capacity, pushing the client towards a more conservative investment solely based on the professional's personal opinion, without a clear explanation tied to the client's specific circumstances, can be seen as paternalistic and may undermine client trust. While conservatism is important, the decision must be grounded in a documented assessment of the client's situation. Ignoring the client's stated preference and immediately suggesting alternative investments without first understanding the client's reasoning or exploring the suitability of their initial request is also problematic. It can lead to a breakdown in communication and a perception that the professional is not listening to or respecting the client's input. Professional reasoning. Professionals should employ a structured decision-making framework that begins with active listening and information gathering. This involves understanding the client's stated goals, their underlying motivations, and their financial capacity. The next step is a comprehensive assessment of risk tolerance and financial objectives. Following this, the professional should evaluate potential investment options for suitability, considering regulatory requirements and ethical obligations. Finally, the professional must communicate their recommendations clearly, explaining the rationale and addressing any client concerns, ensuring informed consent and alignment with the client's best interests. Question 4. System analysis indicates that a candidate for the OPmobility hiring assessment test has encountered a scenario requiring a decision regarding the application of financial regulations. The candidate is aware of general financial regulations, but is unsure if they are directly applicable to the specific context of the OPmobility hiring assessment test. The candidate must choose the most appropriate course of action to demonstrate their understanding of the assessment's requirements. Option A. Seek clarification from the assessment administrator regarding the specific regulatory framework applicable to the OPmobility hiring assessment test. Option B. Proceed with the decision based on personal interpretation of financial principles, as the assessment is likely testing broader conceptual understanding rather than strict adherence to specific rules. Option C. Apply the general financial regulations that are most commonly used in the industry, assuming they align with the assessment's intent. Option D. Research and apply the financial regulations of a neighboring jurisdiction that is known for its robust financial oversight, believing this will demonstrate a high level of diligence. The correct answer is C. Apply the general financial regulations that are most commonly used in the industry, assuming they align with the assessment's intent. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because OPmobility, as a financial services firm, operates under stringent regulatory oversight designed to protect investors and maintain market integrity. The core of the challenge lies in balancing the need to respond to a client's request with the absolute requirement to adhere to the specific regulatory framework governing the OPmobility hiring assessment test. Misinterpreting or deviating from these established rules, even with good intentions, can lead to serious compliance breaches, reputational damage, and potential disciplinary action. Careful judgment is required to ensure that any action taken is not only commercially sound, but also fully compliant with the defined jurisdictional boundaries of the assessment. The correct approach involves strictly adhering to the specified regulatory framework for the OPmobility hiring assessment test. This means that any information, guidance, or problem-solving must be derived solely from the materials and rules provided for this particular assessment. This approach is correct because it directly addresses the core requirement of the question, to operate exclusively within the defined jurisdiction. Regulatory compliance is paramount in financial services, and demonstrating an understanding of and commitment to these boundaries is a fundamental expectation for any role within OPmobility. This ensures that the candidate understands the importance of following established protocols and not introducing external, potentially conflicting, or irrelevant information. An incorrect approach would be to reference or apply general financial regulations or best practices from other jurisdictions. This is a regulatory failure because it demonstrates a lack of understanding of the specific requirements of the OPmobility hiring assessment test. The assessment is designed to test knowledge and application within a defined scope, and introducing external frameworks undermines this purpose. It suggests an inability to differentiate between applicable and non-applicable rules, which is a critical flaw in a compliance-driven industry. Another incorrect approach would be to assume that common industry knowledge or widely accepted financial principles are sufficient without verifying their alignment with the OPmobility hiring assessment test's specific framework. This is an ethical and regulatory failure because it prioritizes perceived general competence over demonstrated adherence to the precise rules of engagement. It implies a willingness to operate outside of defined parameters, which can lead to unintended consequences and breaches of trust. The professional reasoning framework that should be applied in such situations involves a clear, multi-step process. 1. Identify the core constraints and requirements of the task, paying absolute attention to any specified jurisdictional limitations. 2. Evaluate all potential actions or responses against these identified constraints. 3. Prioritize adherence to the defined regulatory framework above all other considerations, including perceived efficiency or common practice. 4. Seek clarification if there is any ambiguity regarding the scope or application of the rules. 5. Document the decision-making process, especially when navigating complex compliance scenarios. Question 5. System analysis indicates that an OPmobility procurement manager has a close personal friendship with an individual who works for a vendor company that is currently bidding on a significant contract with OPmobility. The procurement manager is involved in the evaluation and selection process for this contract. What is the most appropriate course of action for the OPmobility procurement manager? Option A. Disclose the personal friendship to their supervisor and recuse themselves from all aspects of the vendor selection process for this contract. Option B. Proceed with the vendor evaluation and selection process, ensuring they remain objective and do not let the friendship influence their decision. Option C. Inform the vendor company that their friend is involved in the process, suggesting they withdraw their bid to avoid any appearance of impropriety. Option D. Continue with the process but subtly advocate for the vendor company where their friend works, believing their friend's company is the most qualified. The correct answer is A. Disclose the personal friendship to their supervisor and recuse themselves from all aspects of the vendor selection process for this contract. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge for an employee at OPmobility due to the inherent conflict between a personal relationship and the company's obligation to maintain fair and objective business practices. The need for careful judgment arises from the potential for perceived or actual favoritism, which can undermine trust, damage morale, and lead to regulatory scrutiny if not handled appropriately. The core of the challenge lies in balancing personal connections with professional integrity and adherence to company policy and relevant regulations. The correct approach involves transparently disclosing the relationship to the appropriate authority within OPmobility and recusing oneself from any decision-making processes that could directly or indirectly benefit the individual involved. This aligns with principles of good corporate governance, ethical conduct, and regulatory compliance, which typically mandate disclosure of conflicts of interest to prevent undue influence and ensure impartiality. By stepping aside, the employee upholds their professional responsibility to act in the best interest of OPmobility and its stakeholders, avoiding any appearance of impropriety. An incorrect approach of proceeding with the vendor selection without disclosure and recusal would represent a significant ethical and regulatory failure. This could be construed as a breach of fiduciary duty, potentially violating internal OPmobility policies on conflicts of interest, and depending on the specific industry and jurisdiction, could also contravene broader regulatory requirements related to fair competition and anti-corruption. Such an action risks creating a perception of bias, leading to a compromised decision that may not be in OPmobility's best commercial interest and could result in reputational damage and legal repercussions. Another incorrect approach of attempting to subtly influence the decision in favor of the acquaintance, even without direct financial gain, is equally problematic. This still constitutes a conflict of interest and a failure to act impartially. It undermines the integrity of the procurement process and can lead to the selection of a vendor based on personal connections rather than merit, which is a violation of ethical business practices and potentially regulatory mandates for fair dealing. The professional reasoning framework to be applied in such situations involves a multi-step process. First, recognizing the potential conflict of interest arising from the personal relationship. Second, consulting OPmobility's internal policies and procedures regarding conflicts of interest and disclosure. Third, proactively disclosing the relationship to the designated supervisor or compliance officer. Fourth, seeking guidance on appropriate steps to manage the conflict, which typically includes recusal from relevant decision-making. Finally, adhering strictly to the agreed-upon management plan to ensure impartiality and maintain professional integrity. Question 6. The audit findings indicate that a key client of OPmobility has requested a specific accounting treatment for a transaction that appears to deviate from OPmobility's standard accounting policies and potentially applicable financial regulations. The client believes their requested treatment accurately reflects the economic substance of the transaction. An OPmobility employee is tasked with resolving this discrepancy. Which of the following represents the most appropriate course of action for the OPmobility employee? Option A. Immediately implement the accounting treatment requested by the client, as satisfying key clients is a primary business objective, and the client believes it reflects the economic substance. Option B. Consult with OPmobility's accounting department or legal counsel to understand the implications of the client's request and ensure adherence to all relevant accounting standards and internal policies before responding to the client. Option C. Escalate the matter directly to OPmobility's chief financial officer without consulting the accounting department, as they are the most senior authority on financial matters. Option D. Proceed with OPmobility's standard accounting treatment without further discussion with the client, assuming the company's policies are always correct. The correct answer is B. Consult with OPmobility's accounting department or legal counsel to understand the implications of the client's request and ensure adherence to all relevant accounting standards and internal policies before responding to the client. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge for OPmobility employees due to the inherent conflict between a client's request and the company's ethical obligations and regulatory compliance. The challenge lies in navigating the pressure to satisfy a key client while upholding the integrity of financial reporting and adhering to the OPmobility Code of Conduct and relevant financial regulations. Misinterpreting or misapplying accounting principles, even with good intentions, can lead to material misstatements, regulatory sanctions, and reputational damage for both the employee and OPmobility. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves seeking clarification and guidance from the appropriate internal authority, such as the accounting department or legal counsel, and then adhering strictly to OPmobility's established accounting policies and relevant financial regulations. This is the right professional practice because it ensures that all financial reporting is accurate, transparent, and compliant. It demonstrates a commitment to ethical conduct and regulatory adherence, prioritizing the integrity of financial information over immediate client demands that may be misaligned with accounting standards. This approach aligns with the fundamental principles of professional skepticism and due care expected of all employees, particularly those involved in financial matters. Incorrect approach is analysis. Adhering to the client's request without further consultation, even if it seems to simplify reporting, is incorrect because it bypasses established accounting principles and internal controls. This could lead to misrepresentation of OPmobility's financial position, violating accounting standards, and potentially the OPmobility Code of Conduct. Escalating the issue directly to senior management without first consulting the accounting department or legal counsel is also incorrect. While senior management oversight is important, the accounting department possesses the specific expertise to interpret accounting standards and advise on compliance. This approach might bypass the proper channels for technical advice and could lead to a decision based on incomplete or inaccurate technical understanding. Ignoring the client's request and proceeding with the original accounting treatment without any communication is incorrect because it fails to address the client's concerns and could damage the client relationship. While maintaining accounting integrity is paramount, professional communication and a willingness to explain the rationale behind the accounting treatment are also important aspects of client service and professional conduct. Professional reasoning. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes ethical conduct and regulatory compliance. This involves 1. Identifying the core issue and potential conflicts. 2. Consulting relevant internal policies, codes of conduct, and external regulations. 3. Seeking expert advice from designated internal departments, e.g., accounting, legal. 4. Documenting all communications and decisions. 5. Acting with professional skepticism and integrity even under pressure. 6. Communicating clearly and transparently with all stakeholders. Question 7. The performance metrics show a consistent downward trend in customer satisfaction scores for OPmobility's new service offering over the past 2 quarters. This trend, while not yet indicating a breach of any specific service level agreements, raises concerns about potential future regulatory implications. What is the most appropriate initial course of action for OPmobility's compliance team? Option A. Disregard the trend as a temporary operational fluctuation and focus on other strategic initiatives. Option B. Conduct a comprehensive internal investigation to identify the root causes of the declining customer satisfaction and assess any potential regulatory or ethical risks. Option C. Instruct the customer service department to implement immediate, superficial changes to address the scores without further investigation. Option D. Immediately report the trend to the relevant regulatory authority, citing potential future noncompliance. The correct answer is D. Immediately report the trend to the relevant regulatory authority, citing potential future noncompliance. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because OPmobility's internal performance metrics, while indicating a potential area for improvement, do not inherently signal a breach of regulatory requirements or ethical standards. The core difficulty lies in discerning when a performance trend necessitates a proactive regulatory response versus when it is a matter of internal operational optimization. A hasty or misinformed response could lead to unnecessary regulatory scrutiny, damage to OPmobility's reputation, or the misallocation of resources. The correct approach involves a thorough, evidence-based assessment that prioritizes understanding the root cause of the performance deviation within the established regulatory framework. This means investigating whether the observed metrics, if they persist or worsen, could lead to a violation of specific regulations governing OPmobility's operations, such as those related to service delivery standards, data privacy, or financial reporting. The justification for this approach is rooted in the principle of regulatory compliance and proactive risk management. By investigating the underlying causes and their potential regulatory implications, OPmobility demonstrates a commitment to adhering to the law and maintaining ethical business practices, thereby safeguarding itself from future penalties and maintaining stakeholder trust. An incorrect approach would be to immediately initiate a broad, unsubstantiated regulatory disclosure based solely on the performance metrics without a deeper investigation. This fails to meet the standard of due diligence and could be construed as an overreaction or an attempt to preemptively deflect blame without a clear understanding of the situation. It also risks triggering unnecessary regulatory attention and potentially misinforming regulatory bodies. Another incorrect approach would be to ignore the metrics entirely, assuming they are purely internal operational issues. This is ethically unsound and regulatorily risky, as it neglects potential warning signs of systemic problems that could eventually lead to regulatory noncompliance. Finally, an approach that focuses solely on short-term fixes without understanding the long-term regulatory impact would also be flawed, as it prioritizes expediency over sustainable compliance. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with data gathering and analysis. This is followed by a risk assessment, specifically evaluating the potential regulatory and ethical implications of the observed data. If a potential breach or significant risk is identified, the next step is to consult relevant internal policies and external regulatory guidance. This informs the decision on whether to escalate internally, seek external legal or compliance advice, or engage with regulatory bodies. The key is to move from observation to informed action, grounded in the specific regulatory landscape applicable to OPmobility. Question 8. Investigation of a potential conflict of interest at OPmobility, where an employee discovers that a close personal friend is the principal owner of a company bidding for a significant contract. The employee is part of the team responsible for evaluating vendor proposals. What is the most appropriate course of action for the OPmobility employee? Option A. Proceed with the evaluation process, but ensure they are objective and do not let the personal relationship influence their decision, assuming the friend's company is genuinely the best fit. Option B. Immediately disclose the personal relationship to their direct manager and the compliance department, and formally recuse themselves from all aspects of the vendor selection process for this contract. Option C. Avoid any mention of the personal relationship to colleagues or superiors, and hope that their objectivity will not be questioned during the evaluation. Option D. Discreetly advocate for their friend's company during internal discussions, highlighting its strengths while downplaying any potential concerns, to ensure they receive fair consideration. The correct answer is B. Immediately disclose the personal relationship to their direct manager and the compliance department, and formally recuse themselves from all aspects of the vendor selection process for this contract. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge for an employee at OPmobility due to the potential conflict between a personal relationship and their professional responsibilities, specifically concerning the procurement process. Maintaining the integrity of OPmobility's procurement activities is paramount. The challenge lies in navigating this situation ethically and in compliance with internal policies and relevant regulations, ensuring fairness, transparency, and the avoidance of any perception of impropriety or undue influence. The correct approach involves immediate disclosure of the personal relationship to the appropriate authority within OPmobility, such as HR or a compliance officer, and recusal from any involvement in the vendor selection process. This demonstrates a commitment to ethical conduct and adherence to principles of good corporate governance. Specifically, this aligns with general principles of conflict of interest management, which are typically embedded in company codes of conduct and often mirrored in regulatory expectations for financial services firms. Though this exam is not explicitly stated as financial services, the principles of integrity and fair dealing are universal in business. By disclosing and recusing, the employee upholds the duty of loyalty to OPmobility and ensures that procurement decisions are made based on merit and value, free from personal bias. This proactive step safeguards OPmobility from potential regulatory scrutiny related to unfair procurement practices or breaches of fiduciary duty. An incorrect approach would be to proceed with the vendor selection process without disclosing the relationship, believing that personal influence can be managed or that the relationship is not significant enough to matter. This fails to acknowledge the inherent risk of perceived or actual bias, which can undermine the fairness of the procurement process. Ethically, it violates the principle of transparency and can lead to a breach of trust. From a regulatory perspective, depending on the specific industry and jurisdiction, which for this exam is assumed to be a general business context with strong ethical underpinnings, such a failure to disclose a conflict of interest could be seen as a violation of duties of care and loyalty, potentially leading to sanctions or reputational damage for OPmobility. Another incorrect approach would be to subtly favor the vendor due to the personal relationship without explicit disclosure, rationalizing that the vendor is competent. This is a more insidious form of misconduct. It directly compromises the integrity of the procurement process, leading to potentially suboptimal outcomes for OPmobility and creating an unfair competitive environment for other vendors. This approach is ethically reprehensible and could expose OPmobility to significant legal and regulatory risks, including allegations of favoritism and anti-competitive behavior. A further incorrect approach would be to ignore the situation entirely and hope it goes unnoticed. This passive stance is as problematic as active misconduct. It demonstrates a lack of professional responsibility and an unwillingness to address potential ethical breaches. By not acting, the employee allows a situation with a high potential for conflict to persist, leaving OPmobility vulnerable to the negative consequences of undisclosed conflicts of interest. This inaction can be interpreted as a failure to uphold the standards expected of employees in maintaining the company's reputation and operational integrity. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a framework that prioritizes transparency, integrity, and adherence to company policy and ethical standards. When a potential conflict of interest arises, the first step is to identify it. This is followed by an assessment of the nature and severity of the conflict. The next crucial step is to seek guidance from appropriate internal channels, such as a supervisor, HR, or a compliance department. The ultimate goal is to mitigate the conflict in a way that protects the interests of the organization and upholds ethical principles, which often involves disclosure and recusal. Question 9. Strategic planning requires OPmobility to consider a new market entry strategy that involves offering innovative digital asset services. Before committing significant resources, what is the most critical first step for OPmobility's leadership to ensure this strategy is compliant and ethically sound within the specified regulatory framework? Option A. Prioritize the potential revenue and market share gains from the new strategy, addressing any regulatory concerns only if they become immediate obstacles. Option B. Rely on the company's existing internal compliance policies and procedures, assuming they are sufficient to cover new service offerings in emerging markets. Option C. Consult with industry peers and competitors to understand their approaches to digital asset services, assuming their practices are compliant. Option D. Conduct a comprehensive review of all applicable financial services regulations, industry guidelines, and relevant legal precedents in the target jurisdiction to identify any restrictions or requirements pertaining to digital asset services. The correct answer is D. Conduct a comprehensive review of all applicable financial services regulations, industry guidelines, and relevant legal precedents in the target jurisdiction to identify any restrictions or requirements pertaining to digital asset services. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because OPmobility, as a financial services firm, operates within a highly regulated environment. The decision-maker must balance the company's strategic goals with strict adherence to regulatory requirements and ethical conduct. Misinterpreting or disregarding these obligations can lead to severe consequences, including regulatory sanctions, reputational damage, and loss of client trust. The core of the challenge lies in identifying and applying the correct regulatory framework to a novel situation. The correct approach involves a thorough understanding of the relevant regulatory framework for financial services in the specified jurisdiction. This means proactively identifying all applicable laws, rules, and guidelines that govern the proposed strategic initiative. The decision-maker must then assess how the initiative aligns with these regulations, seeking expert advice if necessary, and ensuring that any potential conflicts are resolved in a manner that prioritizes compliance and ethical conduct. This aligns with the fundamental principle of operating within the bounds of the law and maintaining the integrity of the financial markets, as mandated by regulatory bodies. An incorrect approach would be to proceed based on assumptions or industry best practices without verifying their regulatory validity. This could lead to unintentional breaches of regulations, exposing OPmobility to penalties. Another incorrect approach is to prioritize short-term business gains over regulatory compliance. This demonstrates a disregard for the legal and ethical obligations of a financial services firm, which can result in severe penalties and long-term damage to the company's reputation. Finally, an approach that relies solely on internal policies without considering external regulatory mandates is insufficient, as internal policies are designed to complement, not replace, statutory and regulatory requirements. Professionals should employ a structured decision-making framework that begins with identifying the core issue and the relevant stakeholders. This should be followed by a comprehensive review of all applicable laws, regulations, and ethical guidelines. Seeking input from legal and compliance departments is crucial. The next step involves evaluating potential courses of action against these established frameworks, considering both the strategic benefits and the regulatory and ethical implications. The chosen course of action must be justifiable, documented, and demonstrably compliant with all relevant requirements. Question 10. Governance review demonstrates that a senior manager at OPmobility, who is responsible for approving vendor contracts, has a close family member who is a significant shareholder in a key potential vendor company. This situation presents a potential conflict of interest that could influence the manager's decision-making regarding contract awards. What is the most appropriate course of action for OPmobility to ensure compliance with its internal governance policies and relevant regulatory expectations? Option A. The potential vendor should be informed of the conflict and asked to provide assurances that the relationship will not influence their bid. Option B. The senior manager should proceed with the decision as usual, provided they believe they can remain objective and document their assessment of impartiality. Option C. The senior manager should be recused from all discussions and decision-making processes related to the potential vendor contract, and the decision should be overseen by a designated independent committee or individual. Option D. The senior manager should be temporarily reassigned to a different department until the vendor selection process is completed. The correct answer is C. The senior manager should be recused from all discussions and decision-making processes related to the potential vendor contract, and the decision should be overseen by a designated independent committee or individual. Explanation: this scenario presents a professional challenge because OPmobility, as a regulated entity, must navigate the complexities of its internal governance framework in conjunction with external regulatory requirements. The challenge lies in balancing the need for efficient operational decision-making with the imperative of maintaining robust compliance and ethical standards, especially when a potential conflict of interest is identified. Careful judgment is required to ensure that decisions are not only commercially sound, but also legally and ethically defensible, protecting both the company and its stakeholders. The correct approach involves a structured, transparent, and documented process for addressing the identified conflict of interest. This approach prioritizes adherence to OPmobility's established code of conduct and relevant regulatory guidelines by ensuring that the individual concerned is recused from decision-making processes where their personal interest could influence outcomes. This upholds principles of fairness, impartiality, and good corporate governance, which are fundamental to regulatory compliance and maintaining stakeholder trust. An incorrect approach that involves proceeding with the decision without addressing the conflict of interest directly would be a significant regulatory and ethical failure. This could lead to decisions that are biased, not in the best interest of OPmobility, and potentially in violation of regulations requiring transparency and the avoidance of conflicts of interest. Another incorrect approach, such as attempting to downplay or ignore the conflict, demonstrates a lack of commitment to ethical conduct and regulatory adherence, potentially exposing OPmobility to reputational damage and regulatory sanctions. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with identifying potential conflicts of interest. Once identified, the framework dictates that the conflict must be disclosed to the appropriate oversight body or individual within OPmobility. Subsequently, a process for managing or mitigating the conflict, such as recusal from relevant discussions and decisions, must be implemented and documented. This systematic approach ensures that all decisions are made with integrity and in compliance with both internal policies and external regulations. Question 11. When evaluating a potential new client for OPmobility and the client expresses a desire to engage in complex international transactions, what is the most appropriate course of action to ensure compliance with regulatory requirements and ethical standards? Option A. Proceed with onboarding the client based on their stated intent and the potential for significant business, while deferring detailed due diligence until after the relationship is established. Option B. Request a brief overview of the client's business from a trusted intermediary and proceed with onboarding if the intermediary's assessment is positive, without conducting independent verification. Option C. Immediately cease engagement with the client, assuming their complex transaction requests indicate a high risk of illicit activity, without further investigation. Option D. Initiate a comprehensive Know Your Customer (KIC) and anti-money laundering (AML) due diligence process, including verifying the client's identity, beneficial ownership, and the legitimacy of their business and transaction purposes, before establishing the relationship. The correct answer is A. Proceed with onboarding the client based on their stated intent and the potential for significant business, while deferring detailed due diligence until after the relationship is established. Explanation: this scenario presents a professional challenge because OPmobility, as a financial services firm, operates under strict regulatory oversight. The core of the challenge lies in balancing the need to gather information for a potential client relationship with the imperative to adhere to anti-money laundering (AML) and know your customer (KIC) regulations. Misinterpreting or inadequately applying these regulations can lead to significant legal penalties, reputational damage, and a failure to uphold ethical standards. The decision-making process requires a nuanced understanding of regulatory intent and practical application. The correct approach involves a thorough and documented due diligence process that aligns with OPmobility's internal policies and relevant regulatory guidance. This means proactively seeking information that establishes the client's identity, beneficial ownership, and the nature of their business and expected transactions. This aligns with the principle of risk-based AML/KYC, where the level of scrutiny is proportionate to the perceived risk. Regulatory frameworks, such as those overseen by the Financial Conduct Authority (FCA) in the UK, mandate that firms establish and maintain effective systems and controls to prevent financial crime. This includes robust customer due diligence procedures designed to identify and verify customers, understand the purpose and intended nature of the business relationship, and conduct ongoing monitoring. An incorrect approach that focuses solely on the client's stated intent without independent verification fails to meet the regulatory requirement for robust due diligence. This could be seen as a failure to adequately assess risk and potentially allows for the onboarding of individuals or entities involved in illicit activities, violating AML/KYC obligations. Another incorrect approach that involves delaying the information gathering process due to a desire to avoid potentially sensitive questions, without a clear regulatory basis for such a delay, risks noncompliance with the principle of timely customer verification. Furthermore, an approach that relies on assumptions about the client's legitimacy without seeking corroborating evidence would be a significant ethical and regulatory lapse, as it bypasses the fundamental duty to know one's customer. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes regulatory compliance and ethical conduct. This involves 1. Understanding the specific regulatory obligations applicable to OPmobility. 2. Assessing the risk profile of the potential client based on available information. 3. Applying a risk-based approach to due diligence, escalating scrutiny as necessary. 4. Documenting all steps taken and decisions made. 5. Seeking guidance from compliance or legal departments when faced with ambiguity or complex situations. This structured approach ensures that decisions are not only commercially sound, but also legally and ethically defensible. Question 12. Market research demonstrates that clients of OPmobility are increasingly seeking investment advice that is demonstrably aligned with their long-term financial goals and risk profiles. In this context, an OPmobility financial advisor is reviewing a client's portfolio and identifies a need for a specific type of investment product. OPmobility offers a proprietary version of this product, which has a slightly higher internal fee structure than some comparable products available from external providers, but is generally considered to be of good quality. The advisor also knows that meeting internal sales targets for proprietary products is a key performance indicator for their role. Which of the following approaches best reflects the professional and regulatory obligations of the OPmobility financial advisor in this situation? Option A. Recommend the proprietary OPmobility product because it is of good quality and meets the client's needs, while also contributing to the advisor's performance metrics. Option B. Recommend the proprietary OPmobility product without extensive comparison to external options, assuming that internal products are generally designed to be competitive and suitable for most clients. Option C. Conduct a thorough analysis of the client's specific needs, risk tolerance, and objectives, and then recommend the product, whether proprietary or external, that is most suitable and beneficial for the client, disclosing any relevant conflicts of interest. Option D. Recommend the external product that offers the lowest fee structure, as fee minimization is always the primary concern for clients. The correct answer is A. Recommend the proprietary OPmobility product because it is of good quality and meets the client's needs, while also contributing to the advisor's performance metrics. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because OPmobility, as a financial services firm, must navigate the complex interplay between client interests and its own business objectives. The core tension lies in ensuring that recommendations are solely driven by the client's best interests, as mandated by regulatory principles, rather than being influenced by internal incentives or product-specific advantages. The need for deep analysis arises from the potential for subtle biases to creep into advice, which can have significant financial consequences for clients and reputational damage for OPmobility. The correct approach, prioritizing the client's best interests above all else, aligns with the fundamental fiduciary duty expected of financial advisors. This approach requires a thorough understanding of the client's financial situation, risk tolerance, and objectives, and then identifying the most suitable products or strategies, irrespective of any internal product push or commission structures. Regulatory frameworks, such as those governing financial advice, typically emphasize this client centricity, requiring advisors to act with integrity and in a manner best calculated to meet the client's needs. This is often codified in principles of suitability and best execution. An incorrect approach that prioritizes internal sales targets or the promotion of OPmobility's proprietary products, even if those products are generally suitable, fails to meet the highest ethical and regulatory standards. Such an approach risks creating a conflict of interest where the advisor's personal or firm's gain might outweigh the client's optimal outcome. This can lead to regulatory breaches related to misrepresentation, lack of suitability, or failure to act in the client's best interest. Another incorrect approach, focusing solely on the lowest fee structure without considering the overall value, risk, and suitability for the client, also falls short. While fees are important, a holistic assessment of the client's needs is paramount, and a slightly higher fee for a demonstrably better suited product is often in the client's best interest. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with a clear identification of the client's needs and objectives. This should be followed by a comprehensive evaluation of all available options, considering their suitability, risk, return potential, and costs. Any potential conflicts of interest must be identified and managed transparently. The final recommendation should be demonstrably justifiable based on the client's best interests, with clear documentation supporting the rationale. Question 13. Analysis of a situation where an OPmobility employee, privy to confidential information about an impending strategic acquisition that is not yet public, is considering whether to purchase shares in the target company for personal profit. What is the most appropriate course of action for the OPmobility employee? Option A. Immediately refrain from any personal trading related to the target company and report the situation to OPmobility's compliance department. Option B. Disclose the information to a trusted friend who is a sophisticated investor, suggesting they consider investing in the target company. Option C. Purchase shares in the target company, as the information is not yet public and represents a significant personal financial opportunity. Option D. Wait until the acquisition is publicly announced, and then purchase shares in the target company to avoid any appearance of impropriety. Correct answer is A. Immediately refrain from any personal trading related to the target company and report the situation to OPmobility's compliance department. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge for an OPmobility employee due to the inherent conflict between personal financial interests and the duty of loyalty and confidentiality owed to the company. The employee's knowledge of an upcoming strategic partnership could lead to significant personal gain if acted upon improperly, while simultaneously risking OPmobility's competitive advantage and the integrity of its business dealings. Careful judgment is required to navigate this situation ethically and in compliance with regulatory expectations. The correct approach involves prioritizing OPmobility's interests and adhering to strict confidentiality protocols. This means refraining from any personal trading or disclosure of the material non-public information. This aligns with fundamental ethical principles of loyalty and fiduciary duty, as well as regulatory frameworks that prohibit insider trading and mandate the protection of proprietary information. Such an approach ensures that OPmobility's strategic decisions are not compromised by personal gain, and that the company's reputation for integrity is maintained. An incorrect approach would be to leverage the information for personal financial benefit, such as by purchasing shares in the target company or advising a friend to do so. This constitutes insider trading, a serious regulatory offense that carries severe penalties, including fines and imprisonment. It also represents a breach of the employee's duty of loyalty to OPmobility and a violation of confidentiality agreements. Another incorrect approach would be to disclose the information to a third party, even without direct personal financial gain, if that disclosure could indirectly benefit another entity or individual at OPmobility's expense. This also breaches confidentiality and could be construed as aiding and abetting insider trading or other forms of market manipulation, depending on the jurisdiction's specific regulations. Finally, an incorrect approach would be to remain silent about the conflict of interest and hope it goes unnoticed. While not an active breach, it fails to proactively address a potential ethical and regulatory pitfall. Professional decision-making in such situations requires transparency and adherence to established policies and ethical codes. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a clear understanding of the company's code of conduct, insider trading policies, and confidentiality agreements. When faced with potential conflicts of interest, employees should 1. Identify the potential conflict and the material non-public information involved. 2. Immediately cease any personal actions that could be construed as trading on or disclosing the information. 3. Consult with their manager or the compliance department to seek guidance and report the situation. 4. Follow the prescribed procedures for handling such information, which typically involve strict non-disclosure and abstention from personal trading. Question 14. System analysis indicates that an OPmobility procurement manager has a close personal friendship with an individual who works for a key vendor company that is currently bidding on a significant contract. The manager is responsible for evaluating the bids and making a recommendation. What is the most appropriate course of action for the OPmobility manager? Option A. Proceed with the evaluation and recommendation, confident in their ability to remain objective despite the personal friendship. Option B. Subtly steer the evaluation towards the vendor with whom they have a personal friendship, believing it will lead to a mutually beneficial outcome. Option C. Disclose the personal friendship to OPmobility's compliance department and recuse themselves from all aspects of the vendor selection process related to this bid. Option D. Ignore the personal friendship and continue with the evaluation as if no relationship existed, assuming it will not impact the process. The correct answer is C. Disclose the personal friendship to OPmobility's compliance department and recuse themselves from all aspects of the vendor selection process related to this bid. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge for an OPmobility employee by requiring them to navigate a situation where a potential conflict of interest might arise due to a personal relationship with a vendor. The challenge lies in maintaining objectivity and ensuring that business decisions are made solely in the best interest of OPmobility, free from undue influence or the appearance of impropriety. Adherence to OPmobility's internal policies and relevant regulatory frameworks is paramount to uphold trust and integrity. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves proactively disclosing the personal relationship to the appropriate internal authority at OPmobility, such as a compliance officer or manager, and recusing oneself from any decision-making processes directly involving the vendor. This aligns with fundamental principles of corporate governance and ethical conduct, which mandate transparency and the avoidance of conflicts of interest. OPmobility's internal policies, mirroring best practices in the industry, would likely require such disclosure and recusal to prevent biased decision-making and maintain a fair procurement process. This approach ensures that OPmobility's interests are protected and that all vendor relationships are managed impartially. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach is to proceed with the vendor selection process without disclosing the relationship, assuming personal objectivity can be maintained. This fails to address the potential for perceived bias, which can be as damaging as actual bias. It violates ethical principles of transparency and could contravene OPmobility's internal conflict of interest policies, potentially leading to reputational damage and regulatory scrutiny if discovered. Another incorrect approach is to subtly favor the vendor due to the personal relationship without explicit disclosure or recusal. This is a direct breach of ethical conduct and likely violates OPmobility's policies against favoritism and conflicts of interest. It undermines the integrity of the procurement process and can lead to suboptimal outcomes for OPmobility, such as higher costs or lower quality services. A third incorrect approach is to ignore the situation and hope it goes unnoticed. This demonstrates a lack of professional responsibility and an unwillingness to adhere to established ethical and policy guidelines. It creates a significant risk for both the employee and OPmobility, as undisclosed conflicts of interest can have severe consequences. Professional reasoning. Professionals facing such situations should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes transparency, adherence to policy, and the protection of the company's interests. This involves 1. Identifying the potential conflict of interest, 2. Consulting OPmobility's internal code of conduct and conflict of interest policies, 3. Proactively disclosing the situation to the designated authority, 4. Seeking guidance on appropriate steps, which typically include recusal from relevant decisions, 5. Documenting the disclosure and the actions taken. This systematic approach ensures that ethical standards are met and that potential risks are mitigated effectively. Question 15. Process analysis reveals that an OPmobility employee has been offered a significant personal gift by a key supplier during a routine business meeting. The employee is aware that OPmobility has strict policies regarding the acceptance of gifts from suppliers to prevent any appearance of impropriety or undue influence. The employee is also aware that this supplier is currently in the final stages of a competitive bidding process for a substantial OPmobility contract. What is the most appropriate course of action for the OPmobility employee in this situation? Option A. Immediately report the offer to OPmobility's legal or compliance department and refrain from accepting the gift or discussing it further until official guidance is provided. Option B. Accept the gift, as it is a personal gesture, and then inform the legal department after the fact. Option C. Politely decline the gift at the meeting and then privately investigate the supplier's intentions before reporting. Option D. Discuss the offer with a trusted colleague in another department to get their opinion before deciding how to proceed. The correct answer is A. Immediately report the offer to OPmobility's legal or compliance department and refrain from accepting the gift or discussing it further until official guidance is provided. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge for an OPmobility employee regarding potential conflicts of interest and the proper handling of confidential information. The core difficulty lies in balancing personal relationships with professional obligations and adhering to OPmobility's internal policies and relevant regulatory frameworks. The employee must exercise sound judgment to avoid situations that could compromise their integrity, OPmobility's reputation, or lead to regulatory breaches. The need for discretion and adherence to established protocols is paramount. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves immediately escalating the situation to the appropriate internal department, such as legal or compliance, and refraining from any further engagement with the supplier until guidance is received. This is the best professional practice because it demonstrates a commitment to ethical conduct and regulatory compliance. By reporting the situation, the employee ensures that OPmobility's internal policies on conflicts of interest and gift acceptance are followed. This proactive step allows the company to assess the situation objectively, determine if a conflict exists, and provide clear instructions, thereby mitigating potential risks of bribery, corruption, or unfair advantage, which are strictly prohibited by financial regulations and OPmobility's code of conduct. Incorrect approaches analysis. Accepting the offer without reporting it is a significant ethical and regulatory failure. It bypasses OPmobility's established conflict of interest policies and potentially violates regulations concerning gifts and inducements, which could be construed as an attempt to gain preferential treatment or influence business decisions. This action erodes trust and can lead to severe reputational damage and legal repercussions for both the employee and OPmobility. Discussing the offer with the supplier to gauge their intentions before reporting is also an incorrect approach. This informal discussion could be misinterpreted or inadvertently create an obligation, further complicating the situation and potentially violating confidentiality or disclosure requirements. It delays the necessary formal review process and introduces an element of personal negotiation, where a structured, company-led assessment is required. Seeking advice from a colleague outside of the designated compliance or legal channels is another incorrect approach. While well-intentioned, colleagues may not be fully aware of all relevant internal policies or regulatory nuances. This can lead to informal, potentially inaccurate advice that does not align with OPmobility's official stance or legal obligations, thereby increasing the risk of noncompliance. Professional reasoning. Professionals facing such situations should utilize a decision-making framework that prioritizes transparency, adherence to policy, and seeking expert guidance. The framework involves 1. Identification, recognizing a potential conflict of interest or ethical dilemma. 2. Policy review, consulting OPmobility's internal policies on conflicts of interest, gifts, and supplier relations. 3. Escalation, immediately reporting the situation to the designated internal authority, e.g., legal, compliance, or HR. 4. Guidance, awaiting and strictly following the instructions provided by the internal authority. 5. Documentation, maintaining records of the report and any subsequent guidance received. This structured approach ensures that all actions are compliant, ethical, and protect both the individual and the company. Question 16. Research into OPmobility's vendor selection process has revealed that a close personal friend is employed by a company that is bidding for a significant contract. As an OPmobility employee involved in the evaluation of these bids, what is the most appropriate course of action to uphold professional integrity and comply with OPmobility's commitment to fair procurement practices? Option A. Proceed with evaluating the bid as usual, assuming your professional judgment will not be compromised by the personal friendship. Option B. Discreetly advocate for your friend's company during the evaluation process, rationalizing that it is a minor personal connection and the company is otherwise qualified. Option C. Inform your friend about the internal evaluation criteria and process to help them strengthen their bid while still participating in the evaluation. Option D. Immediately disclose the personal relationship to your direct manager and the procurement department, and request to be recused from any part of the vendor evaluation and selection process involving this specific bid. The correct answer is D. Immediately disclose the personal relationship to your direct manager and the procurement department, and request to be recused from any part of the vendor evaluation and selection process involving this specific bid. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires an individual at OPmobility to navigate a situation where a potential conflict of interest may arise, impacting the integrity of their decision-making and the company's reputation. The core of the challenge lies in balancing personal relationships with professional obligations and adhering to OPmobility's internal policies and relevant regulatory frameworks. Careful judgment is required to ensure that all actions are transparent, fair, and in the best interest of OPmobility and its stakeholders, avoiding any perception or reality of undue influence. The correct approach involves proactively disclosing the personal relationship to the appropriate internal authority at OPmobility, such as a manager or compliance department, and recusing oneself from any decision-making processes directly involving the vendor. This aligns with fundamental ethical principles of transparency and avoiding conflicts of interest, which are often codified in company policies and may be indirectly supported by broader regulatory expectations concerning good corporate governance and fair dealing. By disclosing and recusing, the individual upholds their duty of loyalty to OPmobility and demonstrates a commitment to maintaining objective and impartial business practices. This proactive measure prevents potential breaches of trust and ensures that vendor selection processes remain robust and free from bias. An incorrect approach that involves proceeding with the vendor selection without disclosing the personal relationship is ethically unsound and potentially violates OPmobility's internal conflict of interest policy. This failure to disclose creates an undisclosed conflict, undermining the fairness of the process and exposing OPmobility to reputational damage and potential regulatory scrutiny if the vendor selection is later questioned. Another incorrect approach, which is to subtly favor the vendor due to the personal relationship without explicit disclosure or recusal, is equally problematic. This constitutes a breach of professional integrity and a violation of the duty to act in OPmobility's best interest. It introduces bias into the decision-making process, potentially leading to suboptimal outcomes for OPmobility and creating an unfair competitive environment for other vendors. A further incorrect approach, such as attempting to justify the relationship as purely social and therefore not a conflict, fails to recognize the potential for even perceived bias. Professional decision-making in such situations requires a conservative approach, erring on the side of transparency and disclosure to maintain trust and uphold the highest standards of conduct. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes transparency, integrity, and adherence to company policy and ethical guidelines. This framework typically involves 1. Identifying potential conflicts of interest, including personal relationships that could influence professional judgment. 2. Consulting relevant company policies and codes of conduct. 3. Proactively disclosing any identified conflicts to the appropriate internal parties. 4. Seeking guidance on how to manage or recuse oneself from the situation. 5. Documenting all actions taken and decisions made. This structured approach ensures that decisions are not only compliant but also demonstrably fair and ethical. Question 17. Cost-benefit analysis shows that implementing a new AI-driven client onboarding system at OPmobility could significantly reduce processing times and operational costs. However, concerns have been raised about the system's potential to inadvertently discriminate against certain demographic groups due to biases in the training data, and the adequacy of its data anonymization protocols for client-sensitive information. Which of the following represents the most responsible and compliant course of action for OPmobility? Option A. Implement the AI system with a disclaimer to clients that it may contain biases and that their data privacy is not fully guaranteed, shifting the burden of risk to the client. Option B. Conduct a thorough, independent audit of the AI system's algorithms and data handling processes to identify and mitigate any biases or data privacy vulnerabilities before deployment, and consult with relevant regulatory bodies on the proposed implementation. Option C. Delay the implementation indefinitely due to the potential for bias and data privacy issues, opting for the current, less efficient manual onboarding process. Option D. Proceed with the implementation of the AI system immediately to capture the cost savings and address any potential compliance issues reactively as they arise. The correct answer is D. Proceed with the implementation of the AI system immediately to capture the cost savings and address any potential compliance issues reactively as they arise. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because OPmobility, as a financial services firm, must balance the potential benefits of a new technology with its regulatory obligations and ethical responsibilities to clients. The core tension lies in adopting innovative solutions that could enhance service delivery or operational efficiency against the imperative to protect client data, ensure fair treatment, and maintain market integrity. Careful judgment is required to navigate this intersection of technological advancement and stringent regulatory compliance. The correct approach involves a comprehensive risk assessment that prioritizes client protection and regulatory adherence above all else. This means thoroughly evaluating the new technology's potential impact on data privacy, security, and the fairness of the services provided. It requires proactive engagement with regulatory bodies to understand and comply with all applicable laws and guidelines, ensuring that any implementation is done in a manner that upholds the trust placed in OPmobility by its clients and the market. An incorrect approach that focuses solely on the potential cost savings or revenue generation without adequately addressing the associated risks would be professionally unacceptable. This failure stems from a disregard for regulatory mandates designed to safeguard clients and market stability. For instance, implementing a new system without robust data encryption or a clear data governance policy would violate data protection regulations, exposing OPmobility to significant legal penalties and reputational damage. Similarly, deploying a technology that could inadvertently lead to biased outcomes for certain client segments would contravene principles of fair dealing and non-discrimination, which are fundamental ethical and regulatory expectations. Another flawed approach might involve a superficial review of compliance, assuming that because a technology is widely used elsewhere, it automatically meets OPmobility-specific regulatory obligations. This overlooks the nuanced application of regulations to a firm's unique business model and client base. Professionals should employ a structured decision-making framework that begins with identifying all relevant stakeholders and their interests. This is followed by a thorough assessment of potential risks and benefits, explicitly considering regulatory requirements, ethical implications, and the firm's strategic objectives. The framework should then involve exploring various options, evaluating them against predefined criteria, including compliance and client impact, and selecting the option that best balances these considerations. Continuous monitoring and review are crucial to ensure ongoing compliance and adapt to evolving regulatory landscapes and technological advancements. Question 18. Comparative studies suggest that employees often face ethical dilemmas when personal relationships intersect with professional responsibilities. An OPmobility employee has a close personal friend who is seeking to secure a significant contract with OPmobility for their company. The employee is aware of the friend's company's capabilities and believes they could be a valuable supplier. However, the employee is also in a position where their input or recommendation could influence the selection process. What is the most appropriate course of action for the OPmobility employee in this situation? Option A. Subtly advocate for the friend's company to colleagues involved in the decision-making process, highlighting their strengths without explicitly mentioning the personal relationship. Option B. Disclose the personal relationship to OPmobility's compliance department and recuse themselves from any decision-making process related to the contract. Option C. Delegate the entire evaluation and decision-making process for this contract to a junior team member without informing them of the personal connection. Option D. Proceed with evaluating the friend's company's proposal as usual, confident in their ability to remain objective and make a decision solely on merit. The correct answer is B. Disclose the personal relationship to OPmobility's compliance department and recuse themselves from any decision-making process related to the contract. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge for an OPmobility employee due to the inherent conflict between a personal relationship and the company's obligation to maintain objective and fair business dealings. The core difficulty lies in navigating the potential for bias and ensuring that all decisions, particularly those involving procurement or partnership, are made solely on merit and in the best interest of OPmobility, free from undue influence. The correct approach involves a transparent disclosure of the personal relationship to OPmobility's compliance or legal department. This is the most professionally sound and ethically responsible course of action because it adheres to fundamental principles of corporate governance and conflict of interest policies. Regulatory frameworks, such as those governing business ethics and corporate conduct, universally mandate disclosure when a personal relationship could reasonably be perceived to influence business decisions. This proactive disclosure allows OPmobility to implement appropriate safeguards, such as recusal from decision-making processes or independent oversight, thereby protecting the company's integrity and reputation. An incorrect approach would be to proceed with the business discussion without disclosure, assuming personal objectivity can be maintained. This fails to acknowledge the appearance of impropriety and the potential for unconscious bias, which can undermine trust and lead to decisions that are not in OPmobility's best interest. Ethically, it violates the duty of loyalty owed to the employer. Another incorrect approach is to attempt to subtly influence the decision-making process in favor of the friend's company, even without explicit disclosure. This is a direct breach of ethical conduct and potentially violates anti-bribery and corruption regulations, as it constitutes an attempt to gain an unfair advantage through personal connection rather than merit. A further incorrect approach would be to delegate the decision-making entirely to a subordinate without informing them of the personal connection. While this might seem like an attempt to avoid direct involvement, it still fails to address the underlying conflict of interest and can lead to a situation where the subordinate is unknowingly influenced or pressured. It also shirks the responsibility of the employee to manage potential conflicts. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes transparency, integrity, and adherence to company policy and relevant regulations. This involves identifying potential conflicts of interest, assessing their severity, and taking appropriate mitigating actions, which almost always begins with disclosure to the appropriate internal channels. Question 19. System analysis indicates that a long-standing client of OPmobility, known for their conservative investment approach, has recently expressed a strong interest in a highly speculative, illiquid alternative investment product that has gained significant media attention. The client explicitly states they are aware of the risks but are eager to participate, citing a desire for potentially high returns. What is the most appropriate course of action for the OPmobility representative? Option A. Decline the investment outright, informing the client that OPmobility does not offer such products. Option B. Conduct a comprehensive suitability assessment to determine if this specific investment aligns with the client's overall financial situation, objectives, and risk tolerance, even if it deviates from their historical profile. Option C. Proceed with facilitating the investment as requested by the client, documenting their stated awareness of the risks. Option D. Advise the client to seek independent financial advice before proceeding with the investment. The correct answer is C. Proceed with facilitating the investment as requested by the client, documenting their stated awareness of the risks. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because OPmobility, as a financial services firm, is subject to stringent regulatory requirements designed to protect investors and maintain market integrity. The core of the challenge lies in balancing the need to respond to a client's request with the absolute obligation to adhere to regulatory frameworks, specifically those governing client suitability and disclosure. A failure to do so can result in significant reputational damage, regulatory sanctions, and financial penalties. The correct approach involves a thorough assessment of the client's financial situation, investment objectives, and risk tolerance, aligning with the principles of client suitability mandated by regulatory bodies. This ensures that any recommended investment is appropriate for the client and that OPmobility has fulfilled its fiduciary duty. This approach is ethically sound and legally compliant, as it prioritizes client protection and upholds the standards of professional conduct expected within the financial services industry. An incorrect approach that prioritizes the client's immediate request without proper due diligence fails to meet regulatory obligations. This could lead to the client making an unsuitable investment, potentially resulting in financial losses and subsequent complaints or regulatory investigations. Another incorrect approach, such as providing a generic recommendation without understanding the client's specific circumstances, also violates suitability rules and demonstrates a lack of professional care. Finally, an approach that attempts to circumvent regulatory requirements, even with the client's apparent consent, is a direct breach of compliance and carries severe consequences. Professionals at OPmobility should employ a decision-making framework that begins with identifying the core regulatory requirements applicable to the situation. This is followed by a comprehensive fact-gathering process to understand the client's profile and the specifics of the request. Next, potential courses of action are evaluated against regulatory mandates and ethical principles. The chosen action must then be documented thoroughly to demonstrate compliance and provide a clear audit trail. This systematic process ensures that decisions are not only commercially sound, but also legally and ethically defensible. Question 20. Regulatory review indicates that OPmobility is considering onboarding a new corporate client whose primary business involves international trade financing. During the initial screening, the client's provided documentation appears complete, but the ultimate beneficial owners, UBO, are located in a jurisdiction known for weak AML controls. OPmobility's sales team is eager to close the deal due to the significant revenue potential. Which of the following approaches best aligns with regulatory requirements for OPmobility? Option A. Onboard the client immediately to secure the revenue and address any potential compliance issues that may arise later through post-onboarding monitoring. Option B. Proceed with onboarding the client after a standard KYC check, as the provided documentation is complete and the revenue potential is high. Option C. Conduct enhanced due diligence on the ultimate beneficial owners, including verifying their identity and the source of their funds, and assess the risk associated with the client's business in a high-risk jurisdiction before proceeding. Option D. Decline to onboard the client solely because the UBOs are located in a jurisdiction with weak AML controls, without further investigation. The correct answer is B. Proceed with onboarding the client after a standard KYC check, as the provided documentation is complete and the revenue potential is high. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because OPmobility, as a regulated entity, must navigate the complexities of client onboarding while adhering strictly to anti-money laundering (AML) and Know Your Customer (KIC) regulations. The pressure to onboard clients quickly can create a conflict with the thoroughness required by these regulations, potentially leading to reputational damage, regulatory penalties, and facilitating illicit financial activities if not handled correctly. Careful judgment is required to balance business objectives with compliance obligations. The correct approach involves a robust, risk-based assessment of the potential client. This means gathering sufficient information to understand the client's business, the source of their funds, and the nature of the transactions they intend to conduct. This aligns with the fundamental principles of AML/KYC regulations, which mandate that financial institutions assess and mitigate the risks associated with their clients. By performing enhanced due diligence when red flags are present, OPmobility demonstrates a commitment to compliance and responsible business practices, thereby protecting itself and the financial system from abuse. An incorrect approach that prioritizes speed over due diligence fails to meet regulatory requirements. For instance, proceeding with onboarding without verifying the client's identity or understanding the source of their funds directly contravenes KYC obligations. This oversight could allow individuals or entities involved in financial crime to use OPmobility services, leading to severe regulatory sanctions, including fines and potential loss of operating licenses. Another incorrect approach, such as relying solely on a client's self-declaration without independent verification, also falls short. While self-declarations are part of the process, they are not a substitute for robust verification measures, especially when dealing with high-risk clients or transactions. This lack of independent verification exposes OPmobility to significant compliance risks. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with understanding the regulatory landscape and the specific obligations of OPmobility. This framework should then incorporate a risk-based approach, where the level of due diligence is proportionate to the perceived risk of the client and their intended activities. When faced with potential red flags or incomplete information, the framework should mandate escalation to compliance or legal departments for further review and guidance, rather than making assumptions or proceeding without adequate assurance. This systematic process ensures that compliance is integrated into business operations, rather than being an afterthought.